Welcome to our program about the EU-US-Canada trade triangle. We will be discussing a wish list for overcoming the hurdles in transatlantic trade. This event is organized by the European American Chamber of Commerce in New York in collaboration with the delegation of Quebec to New York, as well as Flanders Trade and Invest. My name is Yvonne Bendinger-Rothschild. I'm the Executive Director of the EACC New York, and I'm your host for today's event. To make this program interactive, we encourage our audience members to ask questions. We will feed them to the moderator and make sure we get them answered. Avec ça, je voudrais passer le microphone à Catherine Loubly, la chef de délégation générale du Québec à New York. Catherine va introduire notre panel d'experts. Vous avez la parole.
Merci beaucoup Yvonne. Bonjour et bienvenue, welcome. I'm honored to introduce our three outstanding panelists for this webinar. And I want to thank my friend Yves Wantens, General Representative of the Government of Flanders in the United States. And thank you to you, Yvonne, Executive Director to the European American Chamber of Commerce of New York. So as Delegate General for Quebec, my priority is trade, investment, and greening economies. I've been a strong advocate of keeping our strategic supply chains open and free of hurdles during this pandemic. Canada enjoys important trade agreements with both Europe and the United States, as you know, which will be discussed today by our experts. It's an enviable situation that opens doors to billions of consumers for our businesses to thrive. Now, the role of federated states like Quebec and Flanders is central to trade agreements. I often say that in my work, we're kind of first responders to our industry and consumers. Now, in the coming years, free trade will be more essential than ever to ensure that knowledge, expertise, and goods continue to flow freely and allow us to build more sustainable supply chains. To give you a few numbers, Quebec exports US $91 billion to the world, of which about 70%, $67 billion to the United States. That's over 12,000 Quebec companies that do business in the US, leading to about 250,000 jobs created for Americans. Canada is also the first destination country for US exports, totaling over $255 billion in 2020, leading to close to 900,000 jobs in the US. Now, all this would have been much more difficult without agreements such as NAFTA and its most recent incarnation, USMCA. Likewise, the relationship between Quebec and Europe was strengthened by the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, CETA, thanks to Premier of Quebec, Pierre-Marc Johnson, who was Quebec's chief negotiator for CETA. Now, we'll hear about that today with Douglas Bell, Pierre-Marc Johnson, and Geert Bourgeois. It's an exceptional level of expertise on international trade. And now let me introduce each of them. Geert Bourgeois, member of the European Parliament for Belgium since 2019, lawyer by training. Mr. Bourgeois is part of the New Flemish Alliance, which he founded in 2001. He belongs to the European Conservatives and Reformists groups, and he's also a member of several European Parliament committees on topics such as international trade, the internal market, and consumer protection. And Mr. Bourgeois is also a member of the delegation for relations with India. He previously served as Minister President of Flanders from 2014 to 2019 and has been involved in local and regional politics in Flanders since 1976, including as Flemish Minister of Foreign Affairs, Public Governance, Media and Tourism, and he acted as Flemish Minister of Public Governance, Civic Integration, Tourism, Immovable Heritage, and the Vlaamse. That was from 2009 to 2014. And finally, he became Deputy Minister President of the Government of Flanders in 2009. Welcome. Pierre-Marc Johnson was Premier of Quebec in 1985 and is counsel at Lavery. I'm very honored to introduce him. In addition to being a Premier of our province, lawyer and physician, Mr. Johnson is known for his expertise in the field of international trade, negotiation, of course, and international partnerships. He also has an extensive experience in international negotiations for the United Nations on environmental and development issues. Now, starting in 2009, he acted as chief negotiator for the government of Quebec in the CETA deal between Canada and the European Union, as well as in the softwood lumber dispute between Canada and the United States. Mr. Johnson has advised the Commission for Environmental Cooperation and international organization created by Canada, Mexico, and the US under the North American Agreement on Environmental Cooperation. In 2003, he chaired a similar effort for the Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification. He is co-author of The Environment and NAFTA and Beyond Trade, the case for a broadened international governance agenda, and has penned numerous essays and articles on international trade. Mr. Johnson has served as director and or member of advisory committees for some 20 major corporations, and he currently serves on several boards of directors as well as 4 nonprofit organization boards. Welcome, Premier Johnson.
Merci.
Douglas Bell is a global trade policy leader at E&Y. Douglas advises EY on national and global cross-border economic policy developments, and he also monitors the trade policy environment to identify strategic and operational opportunities to help clients and EY utilize those insights. Prior to joining EY, Douglas worked with the US Department of the Treasury, most recently serving as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Trade and Investment Policy. Now, in this role, he led the department's trade policy development efforts with an emphasis on financial services sector and matters relating to China and the European Union. Prior to his time at Treasury, Douglas managed trade policy and economics at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative as a counselor and assistant USTR, overseeing market access and rule of origin chapters in the TPP negotiations. From 2009 to 2011, he served as the Director for Trade and Investment for the White House National Security Council, advising the President, the National Economic Director, and other senior officials on trade and investment issues. While there, he helped develop the administration's trade agenda and manage policy and the coordination of economic agencies in support of the President's objective. He began his federal government career as Foreign Service Officer with the Department of State and also Deputy Assistant USTR, regional positions in Southeast Asia and the Middle East. Holds a bachelor degree from University of California, Berkeley, and an MBA from MIT Sloan of School Management. Welcome. I look forward to hearing our panelists today, an amazing group, and their thoughts on the hurdles facing Canada, the EU, and the United States in the creation of a potential trade triangle. On this, I'll turn it over to you, Doug.
Great. Well, thank you, Catherine, and appreciate the introductions for myself and the other members as well. This is going to be a great discussion. We're going to, let me just run through the agenda real quickly. We're going to start off by talking about what were some of the lessons learned from the CETA negotiation and outcome, talk a little bit about USMCA, give our sense of what the assessment of the current trade environment, policy environment is with the US, EU, and Canada, and then really dive into what are sort of the opportunities and challenges for cooperation amongst the 3 trading partners, and does that provide a path for a more formalized transatlantic trading environment? So let's start off, and let me pose the first question to Mr. Bourgeois. But what were the lessons that we can draw from the EU-Canada or the CETA agreement for transatlantic trade? What was your takeaway? And in particular, maybe you could also comment on how that is in your position in Flanders, and what does that meant for sort of at that sub-regional level as well?
Okay, thank you very much. Well, mainly 2 lessons for me. First of all, we should be much more assertive to promote international trade, to promote trade on rules-based and free trade agreements. They are creating stability. It's good to avoid conflicts. You can solve them on a civilized way. It's creating prosperity. It's creating jobs, high qualified jobs. Some people are afraid of it. They are against globalization, so-called globalization. Globalization is something of all times. In the ancient times, there was already globalization. In the Middle Ages, there was globalization. So now it's on a bigger scale, but we have the same. It brings people together. It's good for stability, for peace. Second lesson for the European Union is that the Union should split the agreements. CETA is a mixed agreement. It's trade and investment protection. So the trade is a unique competence of the European Union. Investment protection agreements are mixed because member states are transferring some national powers and national competences to the European level. So they have to approve all these mixed agreements, and that's where the problems were also in my country with Wallonia. And now we see rising problems with other free trade agreements like Mercosur. So these are the two big lessons. And then for CETA specifically, it created an enormous boost for our common trade. The EU-Canada trade increased by 25% compared to the previous period. Our exports from Flanders to Canada increased by 34%. Even Wallonia, that was so much opposed to the CETA agreement, has a bigger growth even in its trade with Canada than Flanders has. So in Flanders we didn't have problems with CETA. We are a very open nation. 1 out of 3 of our jobs are depending on trade, which is a very high number. The average in the European Union is 1 out of 7 jobs. So for us it's very important, but there was a fear from the agriculture sector, mostly in Wallonia, also in other countries, but we can show that this fear was not funded, and our market is the quota that Canada can export to the European Union are not reached even. So in general, I'm very happy with this agreement. It's a very comprehensive agreement. I hope that finally, after the provisional application, it could be have the consent of all the parliaments. But in the future, we should avoid this mixed status. Investment is mixed. Trade is, since the beginning of the European Union, a full competence of the European Union. So they always make the same mistake. Once they have a competence, they send it back to the member states, which is a big mistake. There is only one global actor in the European Union, and this is the European Union itself. No one of the member states is powerful enough to make global agreements, and they don't have the competence.
Well, that's really an interesting point in terms of, whether, comprehensive agreements versus disaggregating. I think we're going to want to come back to that, particularly when we start thinking about vis-a-vis the U.S. But so there was another party to that agreement, obviously, on the Canadian side. Mr. Johnson, I'm sort of curious, what your takeaways from that agreement, both in terms of not only the benefits for Canada, but the nitty-gritty sort of challenges of getting an agreement passed, because I think that's sort of one of the larger themes here is, how do you sort of politically, economically set up agreements, get them, move them forward, get them negotiated, and then get them passed through, parliaments or congresses. Yeah. What were your thoughts?
You're absolutely right in identifying that as a major issue. The negotiations started in 2009. In 2013, there was a general agreement, but half a dozen pending issues, including agriculture, rules of origin on textile and clothing, geographic indications, appellations, certification of products, and of course many issues related to the financial sector. And it was not before 2018 that the agreement was finally implemented, at the end of 2018. So it's almost 10 years. Along the way, actually, the negotiation between the United States and Europe intervened in the process. In 2016, there was an interruption of the so-called TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership between Europe and the US. And it was done in a very strange political context. The Commission, the European Commission, decided to suspend the negotiation for a consultation of a broad consultation on investor rights. And that took fire and it influenced our negotiations. The issue was about to what extent can a company, a corporation, sue a government on the basis that it's being discriminated against or it's being expropriated in fact and not compensated. And NGOs in Europe just took that on, sent hundreds of thousands of emails to parliamentarians in the European Parliament. And the net effect was that there was no TTIP. And the net effect on Canada was that it slowed down the discussions beyond the general agreement of 2013 for about a year. And then there were other issues like agriculture. I mean, agriculture is always a pain in the neck for commercial negotiations. I think Mr. Bourgeois will agree with me on that. And there's a political reason for that. The agricultural sector in any country is overrepresented in the political system. Why? Because everybody has a cousin or an uncle or a friend who lives in the country. And generally, the people in the agricultural sector tend to be very focused on their own markets and not that interested in markets beyond their borders, and they're afraid of competition. So agriculture is really something to look at when you address these issues, and it's the last thing you'll solve anyway. Whatever happens, the last thing you'll solve in a negotiation will be about agricultural quotas and recognition of the regulatory systems in terms of health and environment, which is also a major issue. Finally, but that said, we got to the agreement. 2018 in December happened. The agreement that now is in so-called provisional implementation has been since 2018, and we're in a situation actually of free trade between Canada and CETA and Europe. And the CETA has allowed a major increase in trade between the two parties. And the average in the last 3 years has been about 17%. In certain areas, you can aluminum, for instance, in terms of exports from Canada, increased by 620%, which is absolutely huge. And it's true of many other sectors. Generally speaking, it has not affected the trade balance. Canada has a negative trade balance with Europe. And but that said, international negotiations for trade are not only about trade balance. They're about growth, essentially, and cooperation also. I'll end up there. I guess I've taken enough time, and I totally agree with what Gert Bourgeois talked about in the first section.
Well, thank you, Mr. Johnson. I think that's important insights. And, I'm sort of, I think it was striking that you mentioned sort of, the investor state and, so the investor rights, because certainly when we start talking about the policy environment in general, one of the big changes, or certainly the, over the last 6 months is the arrival of the Biden administration, which in many ways takes some similar approaches as the prior administration, but in trade policy terms, represents a change in the U.S. approach, and we've seen this in a number of ways. Sort of the the re-emphasis on sort of multilateral institutions and the importance of sort of the rules-based trading system, and what's I think from as a former U.S. official, one of the really interesting things is that the agreement that the U.S. signed with Canada, the NAFTA agreement or USMCA, really reflected not only sort of a slightly more populist approach of the Trump administration, but also he had willing negotiating partners with the U.S. Democratic Congress, which was in control at the time, and from whom many of the new leadership, trade leadership in the U.S. has been drawn from. So Catherine Tai is the new USTR is probably the most prominent of those, of course, but she was one of the negotiators, and that investment provision was actually dramatically altered in the USMCA, and it really reflected sort of a change in the U.S. approach. And now with this new administration, it creates, and I think we don't want to draw this out a little bit more, but will that create some opportunities for moving forward on transatlantic agreement, or certainly some form of agreement? So we have, for example, the greater emphasis on worker rights, a certain aversion to moving forward with formal agreements, at least what's been discussed before, but then also an effort to really address some of the current tensions. So maybe if we sort of turn to that, so we have a sort of shift in the U.S. from policy, new leadership, but we also have a lot of events that have been driving changes. First and foremost of those has been COVID. And so maybe just sort of switching gears to talk a little bit more about the current environment and the opportunities and challenges that creates. How do we see the impact of COVID, the response, by the various countries? There's been a lot of emphasis put on supply chain. In the EU, we have the Open Strategic Autonomy Initiative. In the US, we've seen the Biden administration move forward with the supply chain executive order. It was probably the most prominent example of that. How do we sort of see that and the emphasis on supply chains implicating the potential for moving forward with a more formal transatlantic trading negotiation or agreements? Mr. Rivera, maybe we'll start with you.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I want to come back on the former question. I want to add something, and I want to congratulate the Premier Johnson with it. In the CETA, there is an ICS, there is an international court system. I strongly believe in it. It's much better than the arbitration, the private arbitration. So for me, it was a model for future free trade agreements. It's also inscribed already with Japan. Unfortunately, it's not in force now because of the problems in the different member states. So this is something I wanted to add. I strongly believe it should be really an international court system in the future for solving the investment protection discussions worldwide. Concerning the new relations with the United States, first of all, I would say multilateralism is back. I think this is important. The Biden administration rejoined the climate, the Paris Agreement, rejoined the UNRWA, rejoined the World Health Organization. Let's say is back in town, is participating in OECD, G7, G20. So I think we have to play together an important role with Canada, of course, with Japan and other countries. We have, but I hope we come back on it. We have to restore WTO. This is for me first priority in multilateralism. But then on our bilateral relations, I think first of all we should restore trust and start with solving the problems. eliminating the irritants, Boeing Airbus, aluminium and steel, all the sanctions, the retaliations that there are, we should sit together at the table and solve them. So that's why I hope really that we have a summit, a physical summit between the President also and the European Commission. I think we are partners. We have all common interest to restore the transatlantic relations. We are allies. There's a growing power. China is a growing power. It's imposing its will and its power, military and concerning raw materials, Africa, the One Belt, One Road, and so. So now it's the moment to work together with countries like Canada, United States, to set together the standards and to work together. Concerning free trade agreement, I'm very modest. I don't think that there will be a TTIP. Also, the Biden administration has the motto "Buy American." President Biden wants first to invest in education and in Industry 4.0 and so on. But I really hope that at least we could have the limited agreement on industrial goods. There was an agreement between President Trump and President Juncker, a very limited agreement, and work together in the digital sector. This is the new industry. For the old industry, I think it will be very difficult to cooperate. We see the priorities, the domestic priorities of the Biden administration. For the digital agenda, we should cooperate, setting the standards together, work together. We share the same values. We are both democracies, and we should find a balance between, let's say, security and privacy. In the United States, it's much more about security. In Europe, it's much more about privacy. But we should not let China set the standards worldwide. So this is the new sector, and there we should try to cooperate and to come to agreements. There's an offer from the European side to create a joint tech council. It's an open invitation. There were first talks with Catherine Tai already, so there are promising contacts, but it's too early because she's composing her team and so on. But I really hope that that we can go further on this way, sharing the same values, being both democracies, together 42% of the GDP. I think now also taking into account the geopolitical changes, China will become the biggest economic power worldwide, that it's good that now we work together. And first of all, we should restore trust, and for multilateralism, I hope we come back on WTO, but for bilateral partnership, it's now the moment to solve the problems, to let them behind us, and to see where we come together, not with a big ambition to have a big comprehensive free trade agreement, just like we have with Canada. Unfortunately, I would hope we could do it, but I think this is too much. We should start focused on digital, and maybe also limited agreement on industrial goods.
So start modest and build from there. So, you mentioned the importance of sort of clearing the table of, the various disputes, and you highlighted a couple of them: Boeing Airbus, the 232 steel and aluminum tariffs. I'm curious, Mr. Johnson, because, particularly on the 232 steel and aluminum tariffs, that's implicated Canada as well. And how do you see us sort of getting through some of those? I mean, my own observation is that Boeing Airbus, it's been a long-standing problem, but both sides stood down on tariffs. I think that's a very important development. It gives some negotiating time. Hopefully the two sides with good faith can make some major progress on that. It's maybe a little bit more complicated now, in that one of the responses that it was sort of alluding to earlier is both trading blocs are really looking at using more subsidies for their own industries coming out of the pandemic, and so that may be some complications. But if we tune to 232, how do you see us kind of getting out of that? Is it just require the U.S. to change its policy, or is there some larger settlement that could be sort of stabilize the steel and aluminum industries? How do you think we should approach that?
First of all, the context in which these restrictions were imposed in the case of Canada was one which was essentially political under the Trump administration. One of the issues was about the inflow of Chinese aluminum, which transited through Canadian ports on the Pacific, essentially through Vancouver. But fundamentally, in the case of aluminum, when you look at it, the major aluminum companies are in Canada. They're not in the US. The production of aluminum is largely concentrated in Canada and North America. Once you settle the issue of the transiting of Chinese aluminum to the US, I think you can resort back to looking at the bilateral relations between Canada and the US. Secondly, the context, I'd like to come back on some of the things said by Gert Bourgeois. The context is one where we seem to agree at this point that there's no real perspective for a major free trade comprehensive agreement at this point between the US and Europe. And why is that? I think that is largely because globalization have gone out of popularity politically. It's difficult for politicians, elected officials who believe in the virtues of free trade and to make a case in front of public opinion. So it means that we have to look at it very specifically, sector by sector. And I think that will not change for a while. The real unfortunate event that happened was the tearing up by the Trump administration in the first days of the administration of the Pacific Agreement. Why? Because you had in the Pacific region, except with China and India, which are not exactly menial, but you add the countries surrounding the Pacific, besides the two major ones we're talking about, a series of assertions that these were the rules of the world. You had, if not an American flag planted in South China Sea, at least an OECD type flag planted in the China Sea. And that would have been the start of a real exchange with China because of the impact it would have had. And eventually, I think various agreements which would have taken place between the US and, but that's past. And it was, it's difficult to replace. So what we'll see is the spaghetti approach to trade. We'll see some more bilateral agreements between the US and others. We'll see more bilateral agreements within the Pacific region and in Europe. We know, because the jurisdiction on trade is in the hands of the Commission and the Union itself, that this will not happen. It cannot happen. We will see then, I believe we should see in the new economy the perspective of necessary cooperation. And in the new economy, I include anything which relates to digital. I include space-related issues because we'll have tens of thousands of satellites sent in lower space orbit soon. I include cooperation on major certification systems in the health sector, in health technologies. I think these are all extraordinarily important for the new economy in which we are. And finally, I think the climate change issue, and it's, when you address it, you talk about technology, you also talk about restrictive regulation of all sorts, fiscal and otherwise. And I think the summit which the new president, President Biden, is convening, is the beginning of something in that field. We have to recognize that climate change is going to be dead at the center of international cooperation in the coming years. We have no choice for our kids and for other generations. Secondly, we know that the Western world and OECD countries have major contributions to make to the approach of less emissions or capture or fiscal policies. And I see that as a major area of concern and of cooperation. Voilà.
Well, I think, you have highlighted it, an interesting thing. And I think, when we speak to that, I think one of the really interesting developments in the trade space is what the EU is doing and that, through its Green Deal and, whether it's carbon pricing or, the potential for a carbon adjustment at the border. And I'm sort of curious, and Ms. Bourgeois, maybe you could speak to this, is how do you see I think we would probably all agree that with Mr. Johnson's point that climate is an area of potential cooperation. It should be an area of potential cooperation. How do we sort of align sort of what the EU is doing, which is in some senses probably the most advanced, certainly in terms of changing its institutions and its trading relationships. How do you see aligning with the United States and Canada, or more broadly, how as trade professionals do we make that work?
Well, I think it's part of trade, and I totally agree with what the Prime Minister said. In the future, free trade agreements of the European Union will be the part of it to subscribe the Paris climate agreements and maybe new objectives that will be formulated now. There is the Biden summit. I hope it's really promising. We should work together, because when you talk about climate and you take measures, it's also about the level playing field. That's why the carbon border adjustment mechanism is at stake, which is a very difficult issue, because it's not always possible to detect the climate circumstances worldwide, in which conditions is steel produced and so on, or some products produced. It should also be WTO compatible, but I think we should work together. Canada, United States, the European Union. I think a transatlantic approach should be of the utmost importance, not a unilateral approach of the EU. We also want to make an impact assessment on our industry. Some of our industries really want to have a CBAM. Other ones are very against, because for them it's not, there's no longer a level playing field. So there's a lot of issues to deal with, but I think we should tackle it. We should work together, make impact assessments, and see where we can come to. It's for sure that international trade is a lever for to tackling the climate change. So it should be part of it. Sustainability is part of it, and it's already a TSD chapter is very important in our latest, even in Mercosur, where we started the negotiations 20 years ago, but the last chapter is also on TSD. So for us, it's a lever to tackle climate change. And for CBAM, I repeat, it's very sensitive, it's very difficult. You cannot work in slogans to deal with it. Impact assessment is necessary. There's a lot of difficulties to see the origin of some products, but at least if we work together, I think we should we can create a lever to change things worldwide.
Well, that's, I think, really sound advice. And, I guess the other, both of you have mentioned at different points in your comments, sort of the role of China in the global economy, and how that's a potential area for, the three, trading groups three parties to really cooperate on. And so I'd be interested in how, how do you actually move that forward in a meaningful way? I mean, it's certainly an issue. I mean, I can attest personally that's been, certainly the EU and the US have been talking about this for, 10 years at least. But how do we? I mean, do we use the Trade and Investment Council? And then I'll throw that question to both of you. And then I think we'd be also very interested if we, to make it a little bit more tangible, if we sort of maybe talk about it in the field of standards, which you both have mentioned. And I think and the reason I say that is if we sort of take a step back, we look at like the TTIP discussions, it's sort of bogged down over market access, but certainly I think both sides who were negotiating at the time felt that the real opportunities were really the behind the border barriers to trade, specifically areas like standards. So that is a historical context. And then two, sort of the emphasis that we see the Chinese government putting on, engaging in international standards and trying to set standards. We see it in 5G, for example. So role of China, how do we cooperate? And two, specifically in the area of standards. Mr. Johnson, I'll give you the first shot, and then we'll turn to Mr. Bourgeois.
Okay. You've identified two areas which are extraordinarily difficult to face. One is China's view of the world, which is different from many Western countries because it's not a democracy. And democracy is at the center of what we are in the US and in Europe, as well as many other places in the world. But we're talking about the US and Europe. And that's a major issue. Why? Because the concept of state intervention, the context of a rules-based system is not the same. I mean, China will agree to a rules-based system in the context of WTO, but when you get to other issues, the concept of rules-based system in China is somewhat slightly different because it allows for more, I would say, discretionary intervention of the state at all levels, including individual rights. So that's a difficult issue. Standards, on the other hand, if you look at Canada and the EU around what we tried to achieve, well, it was only 10 days ago, that finally some kind of protocol intervened between Europe and Canada on how we'll address the reciprocity of standards organization in order to make easier the flow of certain types of goods, including for instance, in the case of the medical sector. And why is it that? Because standards are I would say, preferred route for many corporations who talk about globalization, but who defend their domestic turf with local standards. So these are two very, very difficult issues to tackle, which is why I think we have to think about it and have some people work on that. But I think we'll have to find other areas of cooperation which are easier to address. And I think these can relate paradoxically on the financial sector. Why? Because if you look at American interests, they're worldwide. The pension funds of the US are worldwide actors now, and they have an interest in maintaining a certain type of globalization and a freer flow of capital. And it same applies to European institutions. Even though in bilateral negotiations, you can see huge issues around financial institutions, especially when it comes to solicitation of individuals and publicity and advertising and who does what in the financial sector in any given country. But there's a big thrust there in favor of globalization, both from Europe and North America. Another area, as I said, is climate change. I believe that the necessity to address climate change will bring us to the necessity of adopting in a very fast pace a series of technologies. And I can imagine that there are very specific areas in which carbon capture, diminishing of diminishing of emissions through various types of technology and various processes will be important. That includes, incidentally, steel making, which is which contributes to about 6% of global emissions. But there are now technologies which allow, with the electric arc, there are technologies which allow much less emissions in a context where demand for steel will still be growing, and people will make buildings with steel. So it's there, and we have to address that very concretely. And I see that as an interesting area, in as much as most countries, the US, Canada, and most countries in Europe agree that this is an issue. And if they agree that this is an issue, well, then let's cooperate very specifically on that and allow freer flow of technologies on both sides.
Well, let me turn to you, Mr. Bourgeois. So Mr. Johnson's made the point that maybe China standards, generally speaking, are too difficult to tackle, that there's more promising areas related to carbon and climate. Would you concur with that, or do you think there's areas for cooperation that should be explored in the China and standards area specifically?
Well, in general, I can agree. I always repeat what the former president of the European Commission said, Mr. Juncker. He said China is a partner, it's a competitor, and it's a systemic rival. And we should approach them on this way. So they can be a partner in several things. I agree with the Premier that they can be a partner, and I strongly believe they will do it in the climate change, in the struggle against the climate change. They will participate in the summit that Mr. Biden is organizing. I think there we can cooperate, although we should, of course, be sure that the measures they take, that they are really taken on the floor. If we allow to import green materials for zero tariffs, bicycles made in China, we should be sure that their steel is really climate friendly. We have steel production in Europe, which is best performing in the world now, concerning CO2 emissions and concerning new measures to make it. So we should be able to control them, but they can be a partner in for example, there's the CAI now, European Union with China, an investment agreement where we create reciprocity for our European businesses. This is good. In some things you can be partner, although now it's blocked, and the European Parliament will, of course, not give its approval to it. But then they are a competitor, and there we really should work together. Again, USA, Canada, European Union, Japan, and others, they are over-subsidizing. They create overcapacity. They have state-owned enterprises without a level playing field. So if you want to be a competitor, you should be a fair competitor, and they should follow the rules. And for example, they are investing in the European Union in very strategic sectors. Now we are screening this kind of investments to not allow them to be active in very sensitive sectors. What they are doing, daily they are doing it. They do it in Australia, they do it in Germany, in other countries. So it's a competitor, but we are very aware of the problems, and then of course they are a systemic rival, and it's not a democracy. Human rights are not respected. The Hong Kong democracy is destroyed, let's say. There's forced labor of the Uyghurs, and then we do not talk already about the Tibet situation. So now the European Union is also installing a system just like the Magnitsky law. We can take sanctions against persons of China. Commissioner Reinders is coming with a due diligence proposal so that we can control the supply chain and not allow to import goods produced with forced labor, produced with child labor, produced with violation of human rights, and so on. So we should be very aware that we should not be naive, and we should be able to take measures to assure that our interests and also the human rights of people over there are really protected. So it's yes, in standards, I believe where we will not come to an agreement. There we should create a transatlantic partnership also with Japan and other countries. The digital evolution, Canada, for example, is a world leader in artificial intelligence now. Let's work together there. Data flows, it's very important to find a common ground to organize data flows in a secure way. As I said in the beginning, respecting the security, respecting privacy. Maybe there's an overstretch in the United States and on security. In Europe, much more on privacy, so that we are not open for no new business. But in these fields, in the new industry, we should work together. And I don't believe that we can come to agreements with China in this field.
Yeah. Well, I think sort of a theme that I think you're both sounding is that, you know, in terms of opportunities for cooperation, it's just much easier to do it in areas that are not either been well regulated at this stage, where they're sort of new enough that there isn't an extensive body of existing regulation, or where there's sort of stakeholders, domestic stakeholders, that really make it, you know, so complicated. I mean, we talked about agriculture, which is sort of the poster child for that, right? So it'll be interesting to sort of, you know, see if we can go. I mean, I think there are some concrete opportunities. The privacy shield discussions that the U.S. and the EU are negotiating right now, you know, making progress on that would be a fantastic opportunity to really, you know, enhance the movement of data between those two countries. And then obviously that shield will be, you know, the whole concepts can be extended to other countries as well, including Canada. So that's an important area for development. You know, both of we've sort of talked a little about, all of us have talked a little about the WTO. And, you know, that has historically been sort of differing views on the role of the appellate court. My observation is that it seems like those views have maybe converged over time, and that there may be a greater appetite for developing a sort of a reform agenda that the US, the EU, Canada, Japan, other countries could get around. I'm curious if you, both of you, as sort of keen observers of trade policy, see the same. Is that an area where we can sort of reinvigorate, move the WTO forward? I mean, there's a reform agenda, but we also have the fisheries agreement discussions, you know, lots of things going on there. Can we use that to, you know, drive further momentum for trade liberalization? Mr. Bourgeois, I'll give you the chance to respond first, and then I'll give Mr. Johnson a chance to play off of your comments.
Thank you. Well, I think we should, this is an utmost priority for me and for the European Union. We should save and restore the WTO. We should save multilateralism. We have a lot of free trade agreements with the European Union, but 2/3 of our trade is under the rules of the WTO. So now it's not working. The rules are not adapted to the modern economy. since the Doha round, there's no adaptation of the rules. E-commerce, the digital trade, so the appellate body doesn't work. I think that United States are right with some of their grievances, but they refuse until now to nominate new judges in the appellate body, so we cannot solve conflicts, let's say, in a civic way, what we should do. But they say the procedures take too long, it's too expensive, and the judges are overreaching. There is a judicial overstretch. I think it's a consequence of the rules that are not adapted. There are new cases now there, and there's digital trade, there is e-commerce and so on. All those things are new, but the rules are not adapted. In the meantime, too many countries can intervene. In every conflict there's tens and tens of countries intervening, and then the judges say we have to deal with all the arguments that are developed. So I think we should sit together, not go away. Trump went away. Now it's the moment, I think, and there was a first step. The Biden administration agreed with the appointment of the new Director General, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, and she is very pragmatic. She wants to come to an agreement on fisheries in June or July. So she wants to work to restore the WTO. I think it's absolutely necessary for rules-based trade that there is a multilateral organism that can work. I think that United States.
Actually, can I interrupt you there for Mr. We're actually approaching the hour, and I want to give Mr. Johnson.
Okay, sorry. I'm sorry.
No. I think you made another fantastic points, and I want to make sure Mr. Johnson has a chance to elaborate too. In a minute. We're running short now.
Okay, in a minute. For Canada, a clear rules-based, predictable system is important. Secondly, multilateral approaches are fundamental. Why? Because Canada's wealth depends 60% on international trade. So we can't afford not to think in terms of international trade. Secondly, we have an important neighbor. We have a long border with the United States, and we tend to be an amiable compositeur. Someone who tries to, well, because we have some European roots also, we're close to the Americans, and Canada has launched a series of initiatives in the past 2 years to address the reform of WTO, and I think Canada's role in that will essentially be that. It is important for us on the medium term that the rules-based system is adapted and that everybody buys in, and we can play a role in helping people buying in, I think. That'll be my last comment.
That's a good point to end on.
May you allow me to thank Madame Loubier, Mr. Wattens, and Madame Benziger, and yourself, Doug Bell, for being such an efficient question maker as well as commentator on our comments. Thank you very much, all.
Well, thank you.
I also want to thank all of you and to congratulate my counterpart for the very interesting dialogue. Thank you.
No, I think we all feel like this was a really good discussion. And Yves, I think we're at the point where I can turn it over to you to close out for us, please.
Yes, thank you, Doc. I appreciate it. Very briefly from my side, a big thank you to you for guiding Mr. Johnson and Mr. Bourgeois through the challenges and the hurdles of transatlantic trade. At the same time, a big word of thanks to Yvonne from the Chamber and my colleague Catherine from the delegation of Quebec. I think it is it was an interesting webinar, something we can repeat and I think we can pursue for the future. I also would like to mention that there is a recording of this webinar available on the YouTube channel of EACC. The link you can find on their website. We will also make it available. And from what I heard and saw, we do have challenges ahead, but we also have the options to be able to work together, particularly Europe, Canada, US, sharing the same values, but finding a way to deal with the challenges and deal with the hurdles. Thank you very much for attending, to all of us, to all the attendees. And I'm looking forward to see you guys again for another debate when we take this thing further. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup,
you.
à bientôt.